Up today on the podcast, what happens when the ride goes wrong? Understanding rideshare injury claims in Missouri. So, you've probably taken an Uber or Lyft recently. Maybe you were in Kansas City, St. Louis, wherever, and for whatever reason, you didn't want to drive or you couldn't drive, and you've pulled up the app, you've reserved a car, and you've hopped in. What happens when that convenience turns into chaos? We've seen quite a few ride share, and of course, that's the general term for these types of services, ride share services, ride share apps, Uber and Lyft being the two major players in that category. And we've seen quite a few accidents involving multiple different scenarios. Obviously, you have a driver of the Uber or Lyft, and that person can cause an accident while you're a passenger. You could be a passenger in an Uber and another vehicle causes an accident. And so there it is. You feel like you're hopefully getting into a safe vehicle and going to get to your destination safely. But just as with any other automobile, the statistics are against you because there are lots of accidents on the roadways every day. There's quite a few Ubers and Lyfts on the roadways, especially in the cities. And so it could be just a matter of time that you find yourself in an accident while using a ride share. It's pretty fascinating and awesome, really, how ride shares have changed transportation. I recently was in New York and I got out in the airport and I pulled up Uber. And actually, in New York, they've apparently started an Uber shuttle service. So you and potentially 15 of your closest friends that you've never met can all hop into a large van type vehicle, and it'll take you near where you want to be in that huge city. And then from there, you could get another Uber just for yourself and get to your final destination. You might hop a subway, or what I did is walk about 15 minutes to my final destination. But again, there's lots of different ways that these ride shares are coming into play, and it really has made a significant difference. We taxi cabs now are such a smaller part, and I don't know about you, but I was never a big fan of taxi cabs. Every time I used one, I was convinced that the taxi driver was probably taking the longest way to get there. Sometimes it was the wildest ride I've ever experienced, and so just didn't like it. But, with these ride shares, you pull it up, it tells you exactly what you're going to pay, the destination. It doesn't matter how many miles are involved, right? Up front. This is it. If you want to tip the driver, you can do all that through the app, and there's no real pressure or anything like that. The one thing we need to know is, just like here in our own city, Kansas City, again, there's a growing ride share presence, especially we had the new airport built. And so you got a lot of traffic, a lot of people coming in. We've obviously had the success of the Chiefs. We have the current soccer team, and we're going to have the World Cup here. So again, ride shares are going to even be more increasing over time. They're everywhere, downtown, airport, bar districts, you name it. And again, they've been a great way to avoid potential drunk driving scenarios, right? You can take an Uber or Lyft if you've been drinking. You never have to worry about driving. So again, huge benefits to this situation. But in our episode, we're going to be talking about when an accident happens and there's a ride share involved. We're going to talk about fault. We're going to talk about insurance, passengers' rights, and steps to protect yourself after an accident does happen. So, what are some of the common ride share accidents that we see. Number one, it would be the ride share driver. Their negligence, whether they might be speeding, distracted driving, fatigue, hopefully not intoxication. I think distraction is probably the biggest one because every ride share I've been in, they've got at least one phone up. They're getting dings for potential other rides. They seem to sometimes want to be looking at what's going on with the, and so there's always the potential there for distraction for sure. Then again, other driver negligence. Again, another motorist hits the ride share, and here you are a passenger. So, where can you potentially get a recovery out of that? Again, there can be passenger injuries just from sudden stops or reckless maneuvers. It may not involve another driver. Again, it could be all on the rideshare driver. Another scenario is a rideshare driver hits a pedestrian or a bicyclist, something of that nature. We just finished some episodes here talking about pedestrians and bicyclists and things like that. So we've gone over those situations and how they unfold. But again, rideshare drivers, they're operating a vehicle, and there's a very high possibility that they hit somebody that's a pedestrian or a bicyclist. But again, we even have had a very extreme situation here at our law firm where a rideshare driver, it's, I don't even know how to really explain it. There's certainly no logic behind it, but essentially started dragging our client who was attempting to be a passenger in the vehicle. Everything was legitimate. That was supposed to be their ride, and criminal charges came out of it. We had a civil claim that we handled for the injured passenger or potential passenger. So again, just because somebody's been cleared by the rideshare app to drive on the rideshare app doesn't always mean that person is above reproach. So, a lot of interesting scenarios. Okay, when an accident happens, who's responsible? And it can be difficult because, and by the way, there's another scenario. The rideshare driver may get hurt as the driver, say they're involved in an accident with another driver. Here they are, they're on the clock for the rideshare company, but they may have a claim. And we'll also talk about what that looks like for the actual driver of the rideshare if they're hurt in an accident. But here's what you need to know. Uber and Lyft, they classify their drivers as independent contractors, right? They're not employees of Uber or Lyft. And so, under that umbrella, there's basically three insurance periods that come into play. First, there's the app off period where the driver is not actively working in conjunction with Uber or Lyft. And at that point, the driver's personal insurance applies. Okay. Then you've got app on, we'll call it, right? Where they've got a passenger, they're on their way to pick up a passenger. And in that situation, there's a contingent ride share policy that's in play for insurance purposes. And then there's the ride accepted passenger and vehicle, and there's a basically a $1 million commercial policy that applies at that point. So you kind of have these three stages of when or how insurance coverage comes into play on behalf of this driver. Now, again, we can talk for just a second about Missouri, and we are an at fault state. So, you've got to prove, obviously, if you're making a claim against a rideshare driver, that they did something wrong, something negligent. And then you got to get to the layer of what was their status at the time of this accident. And by doing that, you can figure out, are you going to have insurance coverage through the rideshare app, or are you looking at the person's personal insurance to cover your claim? And that's an important step. Like when we get involved in these types of claims, we have to figure out what stage of their work were they in, because we need to know what insurance company are we going to be connecting with to make this claim. And sometimes there's conflicting stories, but normally it can get sorted out because, again, everything is documented through that app. So if for some reason, say Uber disputes that the driver was on the clock, so to speak, at the time, there's data out there to help us figure out, were they truly on their own at the time, or were they working under the umbrella of the rideshare app? Now, remember, as always, if there's been a rideshare accident, you got to make sure authorities get involved, call 911. You want to obviously get medical attention immediately. Evidence can be very important, as always. Screenshots of the ride info. Again, if you've got the app, it's going to log that you were on this trip. That's huge because, again, you're going to be required to prove that they were on the clock working for Uber or Lyft at the time of the accident, the driver's name, get photos of the vehicles, anything you can do, right? I always talk about this. Evidence is critical, witness statements critical. So you just want to be mindful of that. If, you're not completely disabled in an accident and you're able to do some of those things. Otherwise, you're going to have to rely on hopefully what law enforcement or others have gathered as evidence to move forward with your claim. Now, the other thing is, you're going to, once the dust settles, so to speak, you're going to want to report the incident to Uber or Lyft, and you're probably going to want to seriously consider getting a personal injury lawyer involved in a situation like this, because it's not always straightforward. Again, we've handled many of these, and I would say about 60% of them come together fairly easily, but about 40%, there's some wrinkle with, again, whose insurance coverage comes into play, things like that. And by the way, I will tell you, on the scenario where you're a rideshare driver and you get hurt, there's a couple options for you. So unfortunately, you don't get any real coverage through Uber or Lyft. Usually it's the state minimum requirement. Like, for example, if it's an uninsured motorist or something of that nature that hits you, there's going to be a $25,000 policy there. They just go with the state minimum. Generally speaking, they do have a medical benefits plan in place to where if you're incurring medical bills from an accident, you can submit those for reimbursement. But again, pretty limited. And here's the kicker: if, as a driver, you haven't added an endorsement to your personal policy for this rideshare business that you're doing, you're not going to have any coverage under your own personal policy. They're going to exclude coverage for the time that you were actively driving for Uber or Lyft. And it could even be broader. If you're on the app, right? App on, you're going to probably have a problem. So you want to make sure that if you're driving for Uber or Lyft, that you add the endorsement, the rider that's necessary on your personal policy to cover you for situations where you're not actively transporting a passenger, but you are on the app and you're in some Uber or Lyft zone, if you will. This is critical because you don't want, again, you're on the road, you're driving a lot, the potential of an accident is there. It's generally pretty high. So you want to make sure you're covering yourself as a driver. Okay. I just wanted to cover that because, again, I know a lot of people that drive for these ride shares, and we see them. We see people that get hurt in the middle of a ride share job. And so again, and also we have to think about Uber Eats and things like that, right? DoorDash. Those are the other manifestations of this type of stuff. And again, if you're doing any of that, you need to make sure you know what the insurance coverage looks like in case you're involved in an accident, it's somebody else's fault. Because again, if you haven't let your insurance company know, your personal insurance company know, and you haven't paid for some additional coverage, you could be in trouble because Uber, DoorDash, all those, they're not going to have any coverage there. Now, you also have to remember, just as with any other type of personal injury claim, if you're involved in an accident, ride shares involved in some way, shape, or form, you've got 5 years to make that claim for personal injury here in Missouri. You've got 2 years in Kansas. You just need to be mindful of time limitations. Again, what we always say is you don't want to wait. You want to act quickly. Again, evidence can be lost. You don't want to wait on getting medical treatment because not only is that not good for you medically, it can also be a factor in making your claim. Yes, 5 years, even 2 years, that's quite a bit of time to preserve your claim, but you need to be moving and acting quickly before important evidence disappears, things like that. Okay, so just to wrap this up with the key takeaways, you've got to understand the different insurance layers that are involved because again, if you're involved in an accident and a rideshare operation is in the mix, you got to know, you got to figure out who's on first. Is it going to be Uber or Lyft? Is it going to be this driver's personal insurance? Again, was it caused by somebody else? And are you looking at their insurance coverage? All of these things come into play. If you're the driver of the Uber, like we talked about, you're going to potentially have coverage under Uber or Lyft, depending on what exact status you had at the time of the accident. Again, you're going to want to document everything if you're in an accident like this. And just, you cannot assume that Uber and Lyft will cover you automatically. Again, I've seen it where it's a fight because they want to argue about whether their driver was on app, off app, that kind of deal. And so again, always it's always a good idea consult with a personal injury lawyer and make sure you fully understand your rights, the situation, and how to get compensated for the injuries and damages that you've had out of this. And remember, as always, stay safe, stay informed, and know your rights before your next ride share trip.